everybody, and welcome back to the channel. Today I am going to be talking about A Shadow in Summer, which is the first book in Daniel Abraham's Long Price Quartet. This is a book series that I've been very interested in reading ever since I heard Alan over the Library of Alexandria gush about how much he enjoyed it. And the way that he described it, which was as this very intimate, character-focused novel that follows a collection of characters over their lifespan, was something that sounded very appealing to me. As a character reader, we don't often get those really deep dives into characters' lives, so I was very much looking forward to reading Long Price Quartet. So when Andrew, over at Andrew's Wizardly Reads, organized a buddy read with a bunch of different booktubers, I jumped in and asked if I could join in the group because I think this is going to be a book that I enjoy very much and a series that I enjoy very much, but also it seems to be a series that promotes a lot of reflection and a lot of discussion. So I think it'll be a good one to talk about with some other very insightful booktubers. So we started this month and read the first book, and I think we're going to be doing our discussions over the next 4 months. And if you have read this book or you're interested in reading these books, then hopefully you'll be able to join in with us. Just to provide a little bit of background information before I get into the meat of the video, I wanted to describe the book a little bit. So this is a fantasy book really unlike a lot of others that I have read. It is, as Alan led me to believe, a very intimate, character-focused novel. It follows mainly 4 different characters, but there are a variety of side characters who are very important as well. But the main characters we follow are Mati, who is what is known as a poet in training. So the poets are kind of the magic users of this world. Then we have a character named Itani, who is a laborer who works on the compound of a man who works for the Galtish Empire. So this story takes place in the city-state of Saraket, but we have people from foreign powers, Galt being one of the strongest foreign powers, who have established themselves in the city because it is a hub of trade. And the other 2 main characters that we follow are Amat, who is an overseer who works for this Galtish representative. And then we have Liat, who is her apprentice. And all of these characters are intertwined, some in very obvious ways that they are aware of, and they are also intertwined in some ways that they may not be aware of. A couple of peripheral characters who are very important as well include the owner of this Galtish trade house, the man who has been sent from Galt to establish himself within Saraket. Then we also have the poet, Heshai, who is training Mati, the poet, the apprentice poet. And we have Seedless, and Seedless is a very interesting character. Seedless is known as one of the Ondat, and the Ondat are kind of corporeal manifestations of an abstract idea. So the poets in this universe, the type of magic they use is they use language and abstract understandings of the world to pull down these beings into existence. And I will talk a little bit more about this when I discuss the magic system, but Seedless is one of these beings who has kind of been pulled down into existence and a very complex and dynamic character in his own right. But we follow the lives of these characters as they live in this city-state of Saraket. And like I said, this is a very vibrant city. They have, through Seedless, which again I'll talk about in a couple of minutes, they kind of have a monopoly on the cotton trade. This is their main export. This is their main source of income. And this is what keeps them rich and keeps them able to defend themselves from outside powers. So what we get at the beginning of this story is an attempt by the Galtish Empire to change things in Saraket, to disrupt trade, to disrupt the peace of the city, and to, I think, pave the way for future invasion or future war. So this is a very intensely political story from the beginning. And we're following kind of the evolution of these characters alongside the furthering of this political plot. So it opens up and it is very character driven, very politically based from the beginning. But that is kind of an overview of how the story opens up. And It's actually kind of difficult. I think it would be hard to spoil this story because there's not actually a lot that happens. This is a very slow moving, slow paced story. There's almost no action. It is all character dynamics, character interactions, subtle political maneuverings. And so if that is what you like, then I think that you would love this book. Overall, I really enjoyed A Shadow in Summer. I gave it 4.5 out of 5 stars. It is exactly the kind of thing that I like to read. It incorporates so many of the elements that I enjoy in fantasy, and I read through it very quickly and had to stop myself from continuing on with the series right away. I'm trying to pace myself so that I can stay with the rest of my group, but I can already tell that that is going to be very difficult. And I think for the purposes of this video, what I'm going to do, instead of just kind of running down through the various aspects, I'm going to give some parameters that I think would describe who exactly would enjoy this book. So I have picked out 6 different elements of the story, and I'm just going to make the argument that if you enjoy these things, then A Shadow in Summer would probably be the book for you. So the very first of these elements is if you like a non-traditional fantasy setting. So as you know, the prototypical fantasy setting would be that kind of medieval Western European setting where you've got swords and shields and castles and all of those different things. But this is very distinctly Asian inspired. And this is from the landscape to the architecture to the culture of the people who live within Saraket to the ways that they conduct their business, the types of food that they eat. They're all very distinctly Asian inspired. I did go and watch Alan's review, which I highly recommend and which I will link down below. And he talked a lot about tea houses and how when he studied abroad in Japan, he visited a lot of these tea houses. And so that kind of brought back some memories for him. But it is definitely Asian inspired. And I think that makes for some really fresh and refreshing world building. It gives us a landscape and gives us a setup that deviates a little bit from the norm and from what we expect. And this is something I think that's been happening in fantasy a lot more often over the last decade. We've been getting a multitude of voices in fantasy. We have been seeing these different setups, seeing these different environments for fantasy. And I think that that is only bringing a richness to the genre and is only helping it grow and reach a wider audience. So that's something that I really like. So, and if you are looking for something fresh and unique and a landscape that feels a little bit different from a lot of the typical fantasy that you read, then I think that A Shadow in Summer would definitely fill that criterion for you. And kind of blending in with that Asian-inspired world building and that Asian-inspired landscape, I'm going to talk about the language a little bit in this book. So in terms of the writing, I think that Daniel Abraham's writing is quite good. It is not incredibly flowery. It is not incredibly poetic, but it has kind of an understated beauty. And there were a couple of really lovely lines that I found myself wanting to remember. There was one I took like a little snapshot of so I could write it in my reading journal, but there are definitely some lines that really resonated with me. And I think that when books are very character focused and very slow moving, in my personal opinion, you need to have prose that reflects that and that will pull you in, because if there's not a lot of action for you to latch onto, I think that the author needs to have a compelling way to deliver the characters to you, and I think that Daniel Abraham definitely does. The use of his language also really works in with his world building, and it helps flesh out the story and helps bring it to light. Much like in the Japanese language, in Saraket and in this culture, they use honorifics to denote who the characters are speaking to. And there are 3 different honorifics that Daniel Abraham has used in this story. So there's the honorific of Kvo, there's one Kia or Kaya, I'm not really sure, and then Cha. So these different honorifics can denote different social standings and can show the societal or I guess like the cultural differences between the 2 characters. So, or the socioeconomic differences between the 2 characters. We have honorifics in this story that will denote someone being your teacher, and so they hold a position of respect or a position of power over you. There are honorifics that show a very close and intimate relationship. And then there are honorifics that provide a little bit of distance and respect while also acknowledging that people come from the same social standing. And these become really important in the story because they give us another vehicle or another lens through which we can see how these characters relate to one another. The changing of an honorific can signify a big shift in a relationship. If you go from a very familiar way of greeting another person to a very formal way of greeting another person, that can show that there has been some kind of fracture in that relationship. And of course, if things work in the opposite way, then you can see the characters become closer. And it gives Daniel Abraham a way to demonstrate that either that closeness or that falling apart without actively telling us what the characters are thinking. So there's a lot of showing rather than telling, which I think is quite good storytelling. The way that language helps express the relationships between the characters and helps us as readers understand the relationships of the characters, I think is a testament to the world building and also really helps construct these characters and fully flesh them out. They become very real to you in a very short period of time. And adding on to that use of honorifics, which I think fits very well with that kind of Asian-inspired culture, there's also a series of body movements or gestures that become very important in the story. So whenever you are reading about a character, it will often say things like, they took a pose of understanding, or they took a pose of apology. And so you begin to understand that the way characters move their bodies in this book is very important. There's this entire understated etiquette that helps you understand how the characters relate to one another, how they've been educated, how they have been brought up. We see characters that totally eschew that type of communication, and that tells us something about them, about the respect they have for the situation or the respect that they have for that culture. So there's a lot of subtlety in how Daniel Abraham brings these characters to life, and I think that it just works so well for this type of story. It all builds and builds together to give us these incredibly fleshed out characters, and these characters that you begin to feel invested in very, very early in the story. So I really like that aspect of things. The language itself also builds into the magic system, and this is kind of the third topic that I want to talk about. So if you enjoy an interesting soft magic system, then I would definitely recommend this book to you. And the way that the soft magic system links into the use of language is, like I said at the beginning of this video, the magic users in this world are called poets. And what these poets do is they spend their lives training their minds, training their spirits, trying to build up resiliency and curiosity and an understanding of the world and the people around them, and an understanding of themselves, so that they can be called upon to call down an Ondat. This is kind of the highest representation of their magic, is being able to call down one of these Ondat. And as I explained at the beginning of the video, an Ondat is a corporeal manifestation of an abstract concept. And the Ondat are what have kept cities like Sarikhet, the place where this story takes place, and some of the other city-states nearby. It's what has kept them relevant in terms of trade, in terms of economics, in terms of power within this world. They are able to use these Ondat to fulfill specific purposes. So the Ondat Seedless that I talked about, who plays a big role in this story, he is called Seedless because that is his function. He is able to remove the seeds from things. So his abstract concept, the concept that brought him into life, was to be able to remove the seeds from objects, or to be able to stunt growth or stop growth. And this is very helpful and very useful in the cotton trade, which, as I said, is the main export of Sarikhet. This is a very important part of their economy. And because of Seedless, he can instantaneously de-seed, I guess, all of this cotton and make it easier for processing and then exportation afterwards. And there are different Ondat in different city states, and they all perform a different function. But it is a reflection of the creativity and the power and the strength of will of the poet, what sort of Ondat gets called down. And the very interesting thing about these Ondat is that while they are sentient beings, while they are independent beings, they are fundamentally part of the poet who creates them. So if these poets have any self-doubt, if they are harboring any ill will, if they are not in complete command of their emotions, that is transferred over into the Ondat. And I don't want to give anything away because I think it's best if you discover these characters on your own, but I will say that there were unintentional consequences when the poet called down the Ondat of Seedless. And this is part of the catalyst for the major political intrigue that runs this entire story. So it's a very intricate relationship between poet and Ondat, and they are linked through life force. So if the poet dies, then the Ondat disappears, and the country or the city that is using them will completely lose the use of their power. So it's a very nebulous type of magic system. We're unsure of the rules that bind it. It, like poetry, is very abstract and it doesn't make sense at first, but the longer you spend with Seedless and the more you see the interactions between the poet and their Ondat, the clearer things become. And a really interesting aspect of the magic system, which I tend to really like, this is a trope that I enjoy in stories, is this idea of magic fading or magic crumbling. And this is touched on very early in the story, the idea that the magic harnessed by the poets and the abilities of the poets are diminishing over time. The Ondat that they're able to harness or they're able to control are getting progressively weaker. And we're not sure why that is, how that is happening, but if the Ondat get progressively weaker and weaker, then we know that will have major repercussions on these city-states, because the harnessing of magic is what is keeping them relevant on a global scale. While other empires like the Galtish Empire have had to rely on development of technology and human progress, magic has become a crutch for these other states. And if they lose that contact with the magic, that will put them at an extreme disadvantage on that global scale. So it all makes for a very complex and interesting web. And you can see how the magic system ties into the political maneuvering and how the political maneuvering impacts the characters. It's all very tightly woven. And I think that Daniel Abraham does a really great job of that. Moving on from the soft magic system, I have touched on this kind of throughout my talk, but I think that if you like slow-paced, politically focused stories, then you will likely enjoy A Shadow in Summer. And I don't think that I have to expand on this a whole lot, because I think it's been clear through the rest of the video that that's the type of story you're getting into. If you enjoy fantasy for the breakneck action, if you enjoy fantasy for the intense combat scenes, then this will not be the story for you. This is very meditative in a way. It's very introspective. It's very slow moving, and you get the sense that it is going to build and build into something greater. I think this is very much going to be a story where the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. But I haven't read the whole thing, so I can't be 100% sure on that, but that's just the impression that I get from this series. And then, of course, that's another reason to read this story. If you are going to pick up A Shadow in Summer, you have to be the type of reader who is okay with it taking time for the story to settle in. I think it was probably about 5 chapters or so, and the story is 20 chapters, so that would be about a quarter of the book. It took about a quarter of the book for me to feel fully confident that I understood everything that was happening. There is a huge amount of new terms. There is this is a totally new setup. Like I said, there are things happening that have obviously been put in motion before the story started that are just coming into being throughout the story. And you have to be comfortable with that. You have to be comfortable kind of sitting back and reading and just letting the story flow over you. And this is the way I think I've heard people talk about like Malazan, for example. I am not saying that these two series are the same. This is much, much smaller in scope than Malazan. But I think just like when you decide to embark on that Malazan journey, you have to be willing to sit back and let the narrative flow over you. I think that's the same here in the Long Price Quartet. You need to be happy to be a little bit confused, a little bit lost, and you have to be happy to discover the story over time. There's not going to be any huge kind of Sanderson-esque info dumps. There's not going to be an intricate breakdown of the magic system. There's not going to be a repetition of each action the character takes. This is very much a story where you discover yourself as you go on. I really liked that. I don't know if I would want every story that I read to be like that. Sometimes it's nice to have things laid out for you very simply and in very concrete terms, but I think that unfolding and that discovery fits in very well with the poetic nature of this series. So all of those reasons are great reasons to pick up this story. And the very last one, the very last reason, the type of reader that I think this story will appeal to the most are my character-driven readers. So if you, like me, find that character development, complex, nuanced characters that you will fall in love with, or not even fall in love with, but become very attached to, because these characters are flawed. These are characters that will elicit a range of emotions from you. You will be frustrated, you will be angry, you will be heartbroken, you will be elated, you'll be proud, you will be disappointed. Like, you will run the host of emotions as you read this book. And the first installation is 270 pages. That's nothing. That's so small. That is half the size of like a typical fantasy novel. And I think that it has almost double the character work as most other books that I have read. And it's a little bit different. So when I think of like my favorite character writers, I often think of Robin Hobb, who's got these very complex psychological insights into characters. Or I think of Joe Abercrombie, who has these very distinctive personalities and kind of a wit and a use of dialogue that will make his characters very distinctive from one another. But for these characters, for Daniel Abraham's characters, I think what makes them fantastic is the fact that they feel so real. It is the actions that they take. It is the way that they relate to the other characters in the story. It's the very human aspects of their personalities. Like I said, they are going to mess up. They do mess up. They will remind you of real people because that is the way that they function. And I'm really looking forward to continuing with this series because I know that it takes place over such a huge span of years that I am looking forward to seeing how these characters grow and develop. I think as fantasy readers, or as readers in general, one of those kind of metrics that we tend to look for is, is there character growth over the course of this series? Which, if we ask ourselves, like if we were going to put those same stipulations on real life, how much do people grow in these short spans of time? How much do people change or evolve in a span of weeks or months? Very little. Like, unless it's during your adolescence where kind of growth and identity and the person that you're becoming is happening kind of at an exponential rate. In adulthood, which, if you're reading adult fantasy, most of the characters are adults, change happens slowly. Change happens over time. Change happens as a result of major life events or changes in relationships. And I think that is what I am most looking forward to in the Long Price Quartet, is seeing that change happen on a realistic scale. And I trust that Daniel Abraham will be able to do that in a way that feels very true and keeps me engaged right to the end. I have heard that these books only improve as they go on, which I am really excited about because I already loved book one. and I am very much looking forward to continuing with this series. So I hope that you enjoyed this review. It was less of a review and more of a, if you like these elements of a fantasy story, then perhaps you should give The Long Price Quartet a try. I would highly recommend this to you if you like any of those points that I discussed in the video. And if you have read this, then hopefully you'll be able to join in on the live show and we will be able to chat with you. But that's it for today, and I will see you with another video soon. Bye!